For those just joining us, again, I'm WC Preston, Chief Technical Architect at Druva, and my Twitter handle is WC Preston. My blog is Backup Central. So, I forgot which question. Someone said, I think that was you. What makes Druva different? So that was the part that I wanted to do, which I also subtitled, How Did I End Up Here? Right? Why did I end up here versus some of the other things? So, hopefully, Storage Hulk will immediately start tweet because I remember yesterday he was like, Hulk hate when vendors say they only vendor that does things. So we are the only SaaS data management app in the public cloud, right? That's a very bold statement, and we know that we're not the only one that says that. So let me explain why we are the only one that really is an actual public cloud native SaaS app. A lot of people use that word, cloud native, and especially the native part. And please tell me you guys have seen.
I've seen the meme.
The meme. You haven't seen the movie?
I've seen the movie?
Right.
Kevin,
So many times.
Keith, you and I are going to have to spend some time together. All right.
Inconceivable.
All right. That's inconceivable that you have not seen that movie.
Hey,
So let me just. What's that?
we need to rip up his Tech Field Day card.
Yeah. Yeah. So
I haven't
just.
seen the other case, don't worry.
So first, I'm just going to talk about this, and I'm definitely going to explain why this matters, because it matters very much, right? So if you look at that word native, like we use it in a couple different ways. Either somebody was born somewhere, or like they've adapted to that environment really well. So I was born in Florida, definitely a native of Florida. My parents, who think that I've, since my politics, for example, have changed a little bit since leaving Florida, my parents think I've gone native, right? So there's sort of a couple different ways you can look at native. Druva was born in and lives in the cloud, and the cloud is very, very popular, and that's why everybody else is trying to immigrate here. So we were born there, and let me talk about that. Jaspreet mentioned Office 365 and Salesforce. I like this analogy because I'm assuming everybody's had some exposure to Exchange prior to Office 365, and you know what it's like to manage Exchange. And moving Exchange up into a hosted environment doesn't necessarily change much of that, right? You still have a server that you're managing, maybe a bunch of servers that you're managing, and if you go acquire a new company with 10,000 new employees, you have to do stuff in Exchange, right? You probably need another Exchange server. You have to expand the storage, all of these things. And then there's Office 365. You acquire a company with 50,000 employees, and you just have to do a lot of pointing and clicking with the Office 365 interface, right? And the same thing with Salesforce. I've used Salesforce. I've gotten leads from giant events where I have like 1 million leads. I just upload those up into Salesforce. I don't have to know or care at all about the infrastructure behind the app. And comparing that to SAP. Anybody ever touched SAP?
Yeah.
Anyone? Yeah. It's definitely not that, right? All right. So what does it mean to be a cloud native SaaS app? So I think the biggest one when I think about it is this first one is this idea of part-time use of compute. So, and that's completely the opposite of the way most infrastructure apps are built and the way that most of the apps that are put in the cloud that are not cloud native. Basically, you have a VM that's running 24/7. It's using that resource all day long. So if you're doing a part-time use of compute, and that's really important from a backup perspective because backup only runs a couple of hours a day. And so if you can use the VMs and the resources in the cloud only for a few hours a day, you have a significant cost savings. The next is that if you're building an app in the cloud, you shouldn't be building it just like you're building it in the data center. You should be minimizing the use of block and file storage. You should be looking at things like S3, things like DynamoDB, not SQL Server and block. Does that make sense? All right. And then this other thing is this idea of no pre-provisioning. So if I've done a lot of backups over the years, and I know that when the company buys a new server, when the company acquires a new company, you have a lot of back-end work to do on the backup system to be able to scale that system. And I don't care how awesome or how scalable that physical piece of infrastructure is. If it's built on VMs or physical servers, you've got a lot of work to do to scale your backup system to meet upcoming demand, right? And but if you And what you really do, and because all of that work is really difficult, you tend to do that work way up front. Does that make sense? Right? You don't want to be re-provisioning your backup system every 3 weeks or something. And so you say, well, how much capacity do we need for the next year? And you buy that capacity. And you do that in the data center. You also do that in the cloud. If you are a non-cloud native application, that's what you do. You say, how many servers are we going to need? How much storage are we going to need to meet the demand? You then provision that storage up front. And in the cloud, you pay for what you provision. Right? Which means that if you're not cloud native, you're provisioning for everything and you're paying for everything way up front. But if you're a SaaS service, you should have unlimited scalability without reconfiguration. So you should be able to throw as many apps, as many servers, as much storage, as many users to that app, and it should just scale for you without you having to do anything on the back end. That's what a service is. And a perfect example of that, we have a really large pharmaceutical company as one of our customers. And they started out with a few thousand laptops. We think of that as a small in-sync deployment. And then what happened was they saw somebody saw one too many things on ransomware, and they said, hey, we're thinking about bumping up our licensing and adding more laptops to the configuration. We're like, well, how many? And they're like, 100,000 or so. And we're like, okay. Right? That was kind of the end of the conversation. Obviously, we adjusted the bill and all of that, but basically what had to happen on the back end was nothing from a customer standpoint. Right? Magic just happened. The product scaled. The appropriate number of VMs or containers happened, and S3 just grew. Right? And that's the other thing is no design, install, or management of the infrastructure. No backup servers. Right? I wish I could just sort of chant that. No backup servers. When I think about all of the backup, and from a customer perspective, when I think about that from a backup administrator standpoint, 90% of the things that I spent time doing was configuring the backup server. Very little was done on the front end. Everything was done on the back end. And in this world, in our truly cloud-native SaaS application, none of that is the customer's responsibility. It just scales to meet the customer's demand. The other thing is that in a true SaaS app, you're running in the vendor's account, not yours. Right? You've never logged into Salesforce.com, whatever. Do they run in AWS? I don't know. Do we know that? Salesforce, they run in AWS? Yeah, so you don't create an AWS account to use Salesforce. You don't create an AWS account to use our software. You just log into the customer portal of Druva.com. Right? And then the other thing is that what you get is a single SLA. Jaspreet talked about this. Basically, you've got everything managed from beginning to end. All of the hardware, all of the software, all of the VMs, all of the everything, the security aspect that you talked about, from beginning to end handled for you as a service. You don't have to worry about any of that back-end infrastructure. You only have to worry about installing a client or configuring a client.
Can I just ask, as a customer, do I care that you're cloud native? It's more the SaaS. And this is a bit of a look under the covers of how you're delivering that as to enable you to do things. I'm just wondering, is there such a thing as a non-cloud native SaaS app? And do I care? As long as I get SaaS and it's...
So I struggled with whether I wanted to focus on the word cloud native or SaaS. I focused on cloud native because it means a lot of things. I will say in the end, customers shouldn't care. What the customer cares is about this slide, like why does it matter to a customer, which is my next slide. But they don't care so much, but I'm making a point that if you're not cloud native as an infrastructure app, especially a backup app, and you're just saying, okay, for us to put customer X into the cloud, I'm going to put 4 or 10 VMs in the cloud, and I'm going to run our software up there 24/7, and our VMs only know how to talk to block or file storage, your costs are going to be significantly higher than what our costs would be for that same account, which means it would then cost the customer significantly more.
But then the customer will just make that decision based on the cost. You're just delivering, that person is delivering it in a poor way, which means they can't compete. See, and I agree, you're just giving us a look under the covers. But what's nice about saying the way you did on that last slide with the cloud native piece is showing actually giving some confidence how you would scale. It's not just, we can scale, which is actually, it's going to take weeks to spin up a load of servers, and that is like, because you've built it this way, we can stand by that scale.
And we'll actually go a little bit into the architecture and what it actually looks like, and that's that's going to be first part of Jesse's conversation as well. So let's talk about why it matters, right? So the thing about no pre-provisioning, so the idea is that if you look at how you provision any other data management app, you buy a bunch of stuff up front, you buy a bunch of storage, or you license a bunch of storage up in AWS, you then start using that storage, right? But for a long time, you paid for some stuff that you're not using, right? So your costs just go up. The other that what happens is if you are a customer of a non-cloud native app, your costs do this, right? So what happens is if you're using your own AWS account and you're running a bunch of VMs in it, you know what the worst, so what's the worst thing about having to do a restore? Anyone? Well, if you're running it,
the time and accuracy.
Yeah, okay. We could probably discuss that for forever. But in addition to all of the pain that is involved in a restore, if you're running an AWS in your AWS account, you know what you also get? A giant bill when you're done from AWS for the egress charges. With our customers don't get that. They have a continuous pay-as-you-go pricing based only on consumption, based on just the amount of dedupe capacity they're consuming in the cloud.
So how is that possible? I mean, who's paying that bill?
We are.
It's just normalized.
It's our AWS bill, right? It's obviously we're averaging it out over multiple customers.
So kind of going back to Chris's point, I mean, you could say that the customer doesn't pay the egress charges, but the customer pays the egress charges. It just comes through the Druva cost, the cost of using Druva.
So I would argue that the customer is paying them, but basically by us lowering our COGS on one side, right, by how we're actually using the cloud, we're able to assume those charges without them paying for both of these things. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So their overall cost in the end is lower.
I think that's really what it comes down to, kind of to Chris's point, right? At the end of the day, I mean, you can say that cloud native is a piece. I don't think it's as critical. I think it sounds nice, but at the end of the day, it's what the customer experiences. And so in this case, it's the cost, aside from feature functionality, it's the combined cost of their AWS bill as well as their Druva bill.
There is no AWS bill.
Okay, so it's their
they
Druva bill.
They don't have they just have the Druva bill, which is based either on the Instinct side, it's seats, right? Because that's how that market was priced when we got in there, and then consumption based on the other side. And yeah, it's just literally a bill from us every month.
Okay.
So
The cloud native piece matters because if you are a classic application, you haven't really optimized for things like egress charges, things like put and get costs. You're optimized for a peak capacity disk, which you're just writing to. So just like SQL and NoSQL market, right? So when the new operating system called cloud, to be able to give predictability of price, to be able to give simplicity, if you don't optimize for S3 port cost, egress cost, and you optimize the architecture accordingly, you can't sustain as a vendor. If you can't sustain as a vendor, you can't offer the quality of service you can offer to customers.
Right. But what I was getting at is at the end of it, I mean, that might be the components
How you do
that
it.
build up into it.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, me as a customer, it's really just
What
am I
you care
paying
about is
for it.
yeah.
You're absolutely right. There are two parts of the equation here, and the reason we are bringing this up is that I think there's a big part of the world says, I don't care, give me enough scale. But there's also the curious bunch who's like, show me how you do it, don't just tell me. I've been burned so many times in the past that show me how you do it. So I have a confidence in you that, just to your point, show me how secure you are you commingling data? Show me how you actually take care of egress charges. Show me how you do it. So show me part is important as a confidence building, but this hasn't been sold in the past. It's a paradigm shift. And we get the same question you asked like 5 times in a sales process, where's my AWS bill? There's none.
So, and it's a bit like insurance. Like if I'm paying, there's no deductible. Like there's no extra cost. You've already, like if you had a different solution where you had add egress costs that were additional, it's like, well, I'm paying it now because I needed to restore, and it's like everything's on fire. It's like, but if I'm just paying a premium every month, and I need to do restores, I don't get a surprise at the time when I least want new surprises. Everything is on fire now, and I'm trying to recover. It's like, oh yeah, and there's this extra bill as well. It's like, oh,
Yeah.
really?
Yeah.
So I can see that
there's no big bill up front, and there's no extra bill on the back end. It's just
almost-
a continuous monthly bill.
I would say the fact that you're running on AWS is irrelevant. Like, as a customer, I don't even need to know that. All I need to know is that you're a SaaS solution, and if I'm using, I think you brought up Salesforce is running on AWS. people don't care that's where it's
Yeah.
running. If Salesforce decides to move everything to their own data centers,
And
doesn't matter,
I think
'cause I'm
I
still
think it's a very
consuming.
valid point. The only reason why we're going into it here is that we have a bunch of competitors that say they do this and they don't. Right?
So
They don't have a predictable billing. They don't have. That's the big thing. They don't have a predictable billing, and they don't have predictable scaling, and they don't have easy management. They have all of the same management problems and billing problems that you have in the data center. They just move them up to the cloud. So we're saying if you're going to say you're SaaS, then you need to have these things, right? Your billing should look like Salesforce, right?
Also-
yeah. I'll just finish real quick. And because of this crowd, we thought it was appropriate to go into the whole cloud native thing.
Sure.
And AWS matters for a little bit different reason. If you're an application like Salesforce or CRM, you probably don't care as much. But if you're a data plane, right? In a way, it's a mobility story is important. You want to leverage other services within AWS. And Druva has all the data, which has to commingle, co-play with the platform of your choice, which in many cases is AWS. Like someone asked about data intelligence question, or someone asked about, how do you do X, Y, or Z, or, So from that ecosystem perspective, it becomes important.
Yes.
So when infrastructure app, the cloud matters, not so much for an application.
Yeah, and just to close that out, the funny thing is, a lot of times we don't lead with this in the customer, and the customer always ends up asking us the question anyway. So
Right.
just to sort of finish this out, right? So savings, we talked about. So the fact that we're using S3, so all of our backup data is in S3, not in block. All of our metadata about the customers, which is the file history and all of the dedupe data, is in DynamoDB, right? And because of that, we have unlimited scalability and unlimited global deduplication, right? So I talked a little bit about simplicity, right? No servers. It's a predictable monthly OpEx cost, zero CapEx. I can't say that enough, zero CapEx, right? We talked a little bit about security. He's going to go into security more. Basically, we have one really important thing is we have zero access to customer data ever, right? Period. And we have every major security certification. We already talked about FedRAMP. With scalability, so we're in 13 global regions. We're not in all AWS regions because the region has to meet our requirements for various categories. And then again, just final, you can add any apps, any servers, devices, storage with no reconfiguration.